I'd like to introduce Stephanie Taboada and her presentation on potential for renewable natural gas to decarbonize New York's energy system.
Thank you, Laura. Let me just share my screen here. So first of all, thank you so much for having me today. My name is Stephanie Taboada, and I'm a fourth year chemical engineering PhD student, and I'm here to present on my research, which is on the potential of renewable natural gas to decarbonize New York's energy system. And I know this title is a handful, so I wanted to present an analogy. So for the sake of this analogy, let's say renewable natural gas is comparable to fruits and vegetables. And let's compare fossil fuels to the equivalent of fast food. In this case, we want to become healthier. We want to eat more fruits and vegetables. And so it's the same for New York. We want to consume more renewables. We want to lower our greenhouse gas emissions in the atmosphere. So moving forward with this concept, I wanted to give some background on fossil fuel consumption in New York. So currently, New York consumes pretty much almost half and half natural gas and petroleum, very little coal. Most of the greenhouse gas emissions come from the transportation sector, and then some from electricity and heating for the residential and the commercial sectors, and heating for the industrial, as well as energy uses for industrial processes. And the benefit of renewable natural gas is that it can actually replace one of the fossil fuels that I previously showed, which is fossil natural gas. Why? Because RNG basically has the same chemical composition as fossil natural gas. It can be injected directly into the gas grid. It can replace fossil natural gas in all of its applications. And so it's really a great way to diversify New York State's energy portfolio. So you may be asking why, how is RNG produced? So there are a few feedstocks that RNG can use, but the first step is actually to produce biogas. Biogas is the intermediate product before you reach RNG. So you can use animal manure, for example, that's one feedstock. You can use crops. You can use agricultural residues like straw. You can also use stalks. And you can use wastewater, right, from our wastewater treatment plants. And you can use landfills, specifically the organic part of landfills like food waste. And all of this is inserted into what's called a biodigester. It's really a tank. And you don't have to use all of these at once. You could use either or. And the resulting product is biogas. So once you have biogas, which is made up of 50% methane and CO2, 50-50 of each, then you need to upgrade it. So you need to remove the carbon dioxide and you want just the methane. And so this is now called RNG. This is the upgrading step. And so once you have RNG, you can inject it into the gas grid. And like I said, you can use it for fuel, you can use it for heating purposes, and you can use it for electricity. And so my research, I actually estimated how much New York can produce of biogas and RNG and how much it is currently utilizing. I basically estimated from our agricultural sector, from our waste sector, our landfills, how much is being produced. So right now, we're only utilizing 8% of our biogas and 8% of renewable natural gas. However, if we utilize all of our resources that I previously showed, we can reduce carbon emissions from fossil natural gas by 6%. So another concept that I'm looking at, besides the previous one that I showed, and this is also another aspect of my research, is looking at different ways to produce RNG, and this is called power to gas. And power to gas involves, the first step is producing green hydrogen. So green hydrogen, to produce it, you need a renewable energy source like wind, solar, and that powers what's called an electrolyzer. And the electrolyzer splits the water. So you have hydrogen and oxygen, and it splits the water. You just want the hydrogen. So that's the green hydrogen I'm talking about because there's no carbon emissions involved. And this can actually be injected into the gas grid along with RNG if desired, and it can also obviously result in a decrease in carbon emissions. So the next step involves utilizing this green hydrogen plus CO2 emissions from the atmosphere and a catalyst, which is the part of the research that I'm working on, is developing an innovative catalyst to produce RNG directly. And again, you can inject this into the gas grid and utilize RNG for the same applications I previously mentioned. So my research actually shows that if we utilize RNG plus green hydrogen, we can eliminate 20% of greenhouse gases from fossil natural gas in New York. And then this is another aspect of my research, which is pretty innovative and I would say valuable specifically for New York State, which is actually producing synthesis gas from biogas, utilizing a catalyst. And synthesis gas is an extremely valuable feedstock because it basically is the precursor to so many of our feedstocks, so many of our fuels, our chemicals. It can be used for power generation. It can be used to produce ammonia. It's really the main driver of like a chemical industry. And so in terms of policy, right now, California is the epicenter of the RNG industry. Why? Because the governor of California back in 2007 passed what's called the low carbon fuel standard. And the low carbon fuel standard, essentially what it does is it mandates a 20% mixing of a low carbon fuel with a transportation fuel, like your typical transportation fuel. And so what it's done is it's created a market. So many RNG producers from other states are now transporting their fuel to California to make use of this mandate because there's such a demand from the producers that need this fuel, right? This RNG because of the mandate. And so it's also created a boom in the RNG industry. It's led to RNG projects. It's generated a significant amount of benefits for California, which I'll go into. And a lot of other states are looking into this, like Washington, Colorado, South Dakota, Hawaii even now. So it's extremely beneficial and definitely something to consider. And here are some of the benefits. For example, California is estimating an economic impact of 14.3 billion. It's estimating a job creation of 130,000 in construction engineering services. And for the first time ever, they're actually showing carbon negative transportation fuel, which basically means that they're lowering the amount of carbon in their atmosphere. They're not just, remaining neutral, they're actually decreasing it, which is absolutely fantastic. It's the first time anything like this has ever been done. And they're only investing about $1 billion. And that covers about 160 RNG projects in the state. And so New York State actually has a LCFS bill that has not been passed. It's pending. And so I propose that New York State should pass the bill. Why? Because obviously there will be environmental benefits, a decrease in our greenhouse gases. There will also be economic benefits, like in California, you're seeing job creation, an increase in revenue. It will also generate technological innovation because now you're seeing a demand for renewables. So there will be companies interested in creating new pathways to produce RNG, as well as other types of renewable fuels. And then, subsequently, it will create a strong renewable industry. Some additional policies to consider in New York State are incentives for dairy farmers, specifically to connect RNG to the gas grid. And then policies such as standards. California, for example, has a standard that RNG producers use when injecting RNG into their gas grid. So we need to work with other states that already have these standards to make sure they're similar nationwide. And we also need to invest in technological funding to create pathways to RNG. For example, my research group is currently looking at wetland plants to produce RNG. This is something new that has never been done before, but we need funding. And so the future for New York is RNG. right? So we can use RNG to diversify our energy portfolio. We can use RNG to decrease greenhouse gas emissions, and we can also use RNG to create a chemical industry in New York. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Stephanie. I'll start out with the judge's question by asking you similarly, what would be the quantitative metrics you would use to assess that if we were to move towards that policy direction of utilizing RNG, what type of metrics would you say were indicating we're getting a good return on that investment?
I think obviously would be if there's significant RNG production being produced, if there's also a decrease in greenhouse gas emissions. I think, obviously if we're also utilizing RNG in, let's say, areas where landfills are located, which are predominantly upstate, that would be a great way to know. And obviously if it's being used in the areas that I mentioned, specifically like transportation fuels, I think that would be a great way to know. And obviously if there's a significant boom in private industry.
And okay, thank you for that. And so also, are you proposing that this, it sounds to me that, I mean, RNG is still carbon based and ultimately there's still going to be the CO2 question, no matter what source of carbon you're using, but this would at least be an important transition is what I'm hearing to get other industries involved or get dairy farmers involved, the agricultural waste you mentioned, et cetera, to at least start utilizing this as opposed to, well, we're going to produce it anyway and not make use of it. So is it more of a transition to get more people involved where we need to get eventually towards risk elimination? It seems like it's more of a risk reduction step.
That's right. A lot of dairy farmers have said that, they really don't want to spend the money to connect to the gas grid. It's extremely expensive. The other part of this that I mentioned is technological innovation, because, depending on the feedstock, you can also have different compositions of biogas. So it's not always, financially appropriate to upgrade to RNG. So we need to come up with different ways to produce it so that a vast majority of the feedstocks can go to RNG.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Question on a very good presentation, very interesting. Residential home construction, one of the topics that has come up in terms of changing standards for residential home construction is mandating essentially the phase out of the use of natural gas in homes as a source of home heating. I'm wondering how this renewable natural gas would fit into what I think, as Jeff said, would fit into kind of this transition, because there seems to be a trade-off between, kind of this immediate push for kind of a radical decarbonization of the economy, and also, other forces that are pushing for a more gradual movement away from fossil fuel based economy.
So I don't think I quite understand your question. You're asking for standards, or I guess.
Well, I guess the question is, the question is, there's investment that you're talking about in renewable natural gas, and as one makes investments, essentially, to have return on investment, there has to be some longevity to the assets, right, that you're investing in, and at the same time, there's a policy effort essentially to more rapidly decarbonize the economy. I'm just wondering how your thoughts on how this renewable natural gas might fit into a pretty rapidly changing energy grid.
I see. Okay. I think the biggest obstacle right now is that there aren't any nationwide standards. That's from my understanding. So that's why in my presentation I mentioned New York State really has to work, I think, collaboratively with other states to come up with a type of standard to inject RNG and make sure that it can be used appropriately for the heating, electricity, and for all these other sectors. Yes, I think that it also provides a sort of stability, I think, for utility providers. So yes, I think that is probably one of the biggest obstacles. And I mean, in terms of a progressive, I guess, radical decarbonization, I don't know if I would call it radical, because California they've passed, the first step they did was, like I said, back in 2007, the LCFS bill. And then they've gradually, I think, added more policies. Right now, I think it appears more radical, but it's really been market driven. A lot of the investments have been from private industry.
Thank you. And I didn't mean to suggest that renewable natural gas. I wasn't putting that into the radical category. I guess I'm thinking more the people who are pushing for immediate standard changes in terms of how businesses and homes are heated, and where there's discussion of actually no natural gas being involved, which is obviously a pretty dramatic change from the landscape that we're currently in. So thank you. I appreciate your.
I see. Right. Yeah, definitely. I think that RNG maybe could substantially replace fossil natural gas, like I discussed. So maybe there would even be a discussion in that sense of maybe there isn't a need to replace, natural gas at all. Like, I mean, remove it. I mean, right. So that could be one potential way to introduce RNG, into the discussion. Like I said, to diversify our energy portfolio.